Hi everyone, it's Steve Whitehorn again, and we're continuing the theme of holy habits, and this week's instalment is on serving the poor. But who do we define as poor? Beggars in the street? People who have a particularly messy house? There's plenty of people out there who feel that they don't have enough money or they don't earn enough money. Are they poor? If you go and do a Google search on the internet, you can find several different definitions of what poverty is, but they all generally define poverty as a lack of the means necessary to meet basic needs. And those basic needs can be physical, so somewhere to live, something to wear, something to eat, or they could also be socio-political, so for example good health, education, friends. But when you think of these things, a lot of them really come down to a lack of money. In instances of extreme poverty, people tend to ignore the socio-political aspects and concentrate mainly on trying to address their physical needs. On top of all that, another problem with poverty is that society stigmatizes it. Poor people tend to be looked down upon. They're treated as lesser people and certainly not as equals. They're vulnerable, and as a result it does put them at risk of exploitation. But why are there poor people? Why is there this inequality in society? Well, in Deuteronomy 15 verse 11, God tells the Israelites, "There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land." There will always be poor people in the land. Now, it would be nice to think that God meant that there would always be people with less wealth than others, and that at some point we would eradicate poverty. Unfortunately, I don't believe that's the case. Poverty isn't simply something that's passed down from generation to generation. Rachel and I, for example, were recently watching an episode of Missing Person. It's a TV programme. And in this particular episode, it featured the search for missing persons in Gloucestershire. And one of these people was a homeless man who'd gone missing for a couple of months. And they interviewed his sister, and it transpires that this man once had a job and a home, and he was doing okay for himself. But then his mother died, and he didn't cope with that very well, and he slipped into drug use, spent all his money on drugs, couldn't pay for his house, lost his job. And it's just one example of how someone could be doing absolutely fine and then suddenly find themselves in poverty. Something happens, that person affected makes some poor choices, and they end up in poverty. Back to that Deuteronomy passage, we're commanded to be open-handed towards those who are poor and needy. But why should we do that? And how should we do it? Well, in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 35, the Israelites are told, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner or stranger, so they can continue to live among you." And furthermore, in Psalm 41, the first couple of verses read, "Blessed are those who have regard for the weak. The Lord delivers them in times of trouble. The Lord protects and preserves them. They are counted among the blessed in the land. He does not give them over to the desire of their foes." So we're commanded by God to look after the poor and needy, but we're also considered blessed for doing so. We're protected and preserved by the Lord. So reason's good enough to be looking out for the poor and needy. But in terms of how we go about that, there's actually a number of references in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy that help us and cover a variety of situations. And I'm going to be referring to these books as we go through the sermon. Both of the books contain laws and rules for the Israelites on how they are to live their lives. Leviticus was written around the time the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, and it was written as a guide for holy living. Deuteronomy was written around the time that they were about to enter the Promised Land, so it was intended for the new generation, and it was written to remind them of what God had done for them, but there was also reminders of how to continue that holy living. So let's have a look at some of the verses on serving the poor. I'm not going to be able to cover all aspects because we simply don't have the time, but I will try and cover some of the perhaps more pertinent ones. So let's begin with employment. Deuteronomy 24 verses 14 and 15 tell us, "Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are counting on it. Otherwise they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin." Now, some Israelites would have had their own fields of crops and or livestock, and therefore they would employ labourers to tend the fields and animals. And this verse isn't just telling them to pay their labourers their wages, but it's specifically to make sure that those who are poor and needy receive their payment. But the thing is, I'm not sure it really ends there. You see, in order to know who among their labourers are poor and needy, the landowner would need to actually have a deeper knowledge of their employees. So there's an implicit suggestion there that they actually need to get to know their staff. They need to be on kind of more friendly terms to be able to understand their needs. Now, we may not be managers of our own businesses, and we may not have any employees whom we pay, but I'm pretty sure we've all employed somebody to do some work in our house or on our cars. And we'll struggle to establish if that person is in need, to be fair, because they may only be in our house or working on our car for a couple of hours. So you barely get time to make a cup of tea or coffee and get a bit of a conversation going. But either way, whether they're in need or not, we absolutely should make sure that we pay them when their payment is due. But here's something to consider, noting that we may not know if they are poor and needy. But if we notice that they're perhaps not doing the job particularly well, or we don't think they're doing it right, certainly not as we were expecting it to be done, rather than wait till they've finished and then have a bit of an argument over, well, I'm not really going to pay you full price, or you may not even want to pay them at all, how about being a bit more proactive? If we notice they're not doing something as we expect them, then mention it. I wasn't expecting it to look like that. I didn't expect you to do it like this. It might just bring something out there that can help them to make sure that they do the job as you expect it. Because they certainly don't want to be walking away without having a full pay, and you certainly don't want them leaving you with a job that is not up to scratch. So they can get their full pay, you get a job that's well done. It's a win-win situation. And there's one way to address the cash aspect. But Deuteronomy 15 verses 7 to 9 tells us, "If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbour this wicked thought, the 7th year, the year for cancelling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin." Israelites were commanded to be generous to those in need, but also to ensure that the terms of any loan are not going to put the needy person's health or livelihood at risk. Perhaps some of the banks over the past few years could have learnt a lesson or two from this passage. The passage also goes on about one of the other things that God commanded the Israelites, which is about cancelling debts every 7th year. And so not to be withholding that generosity as we're getting up to the 7th year, because we don't want to be loaning money out that we're not going to get back. So there seems to be a bit of an implicit suggestion again that actually some of this help that you are providing to the needy is actually a gift. But to be open-handed towards the poor is not just simply to give handouts all the time. We also need to consider helping them to climb their own way out of their poverty. Now, it's likely that that will be in the form of some kind of gift or loan of money, but we need to kind of temper that with how we can help them manage their finances. And there's a bit of a fine balance between being tight-fisted and being generous. Now, I read a couple of interesting stories about another TV program called Rich House, Poor House. It's on Channel 5. Now, in this program, two households swap houses and budgets for 1 week. And in one particular episode, a family that was in the top 10% of wealthiest people in the country swapped with a family who are among the poorest 10% of people in the country. Now, whilst the poorer family enjoyed a budget of over £1,000 for a week, the wealthier family had to keep checking the electricity meter for fear of not being able to afford the electricity to boil the kettle for a cup of tea. Their budget was limited because the poorer family had a credit card debt of £11,000, and it was effectively crippling them. And what the wealthy family realised was that this shortage of money was effectively in their faces everywhere they turned. And so they decided that they would help this family out. And they offered to pay off 3/4 of their credit card debt and also match the savings that they would earn over the next 3 years so they could help build a deposit to buy their own house. Now, it's an amazing and generous gesture. But there's an important point here. They didn't pay off all the debt. The gift that they gave them was actually tempered, and the intention here was that the poorer family would be given some breathing room to be able to actually work their way out of their own debt so that they could feel the achievement of getting debt free for themselves. But not everybody needs a gift or a loan. Some just need a bit of help to manage their finances. Now, whilst we're not all financial advisors, we've probably all got our own little bit of advice to give to people. But we can also point people in the right direction to get professional advice. And we can always point them to the Citizens Advice Bureau, or there's an organisation called Christians Against Poverty. And I know there's a few people in our congregation who are aware of them, and they can go to them for debt advice. After all, it can all help somebody to get themselves out of poverty. If you want to go a step further than just simply pointing them to these organisations, you may want to consider volunteering at the food bank, or maybe look at the Christians Against Poverty website to see how you can help their mission. Now, I mentioned food bank, so of course, with the food bank, you could donate food and toiletries to be handed out to those who need a bit of a break from food bills. And there's a couple of Bible verses that actually talk about this. So, firstly, Leviticus 23, verse 22 says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigners residing among you. I am the Lord your God." And secondly, Deuteronomy 23, verses 24 and 25 say, "If you enter your neighbour's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. If you enter your neighbour's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to their standing grain." The intention here was that the poor people could feed on the leftover grapes or grain. But it's interesting that it's set up so the landowner simply leaves the produce for the poor to help themselves, rather than it being a specific act of giving. It's an act of charity that's actually covert. It's one that can actually go unnoticed by society and unrecognised. But it's very much noticed and recognised by God. That said, the verse in Deuteronomy, it's quite clear from this that the poor are not to take advantage of this. They're only to take what they intend to eat at the time. They can't turn up and take away a nice load for later on. Now, we don't necessarily have fields of grape and grain, and we certainly don't have the ability for people to wander freely around our land. But as a society, we do have a tendency to buy a bit too much food. I did a bit of digging on this, and apparently in 2018, the UK threw away 6.6 million tonnes of food waste, of which 70%, and that's just over 4 million tonnes, could have been eaten. So if you're now thinking, actually, I have got a little extra food in the cupboards and I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, perhaps you could get it to the food bank. If, like me, you like to plan what you're eating and then you only end up buying what you need, you're in a good position to be able to look up the priority list for food banks, so what they're short of, and add a few of those items to your shopping list. It doesn't need to cost much, but it all helps plenty of people who are in need. So, as I've said, I can't cover all the aspects of poverty, but I've covered a few there. So in summary, there will always be poor people in our lands. They're poor for a variety of reasons, and we are called to help them. A reminder of Psalm 41, those first two verses. Blessed are those who have a regard for the weak. The Lord delivers them in times of trouble. The Lord protects and preserves them. They are counted among the blessed in the land. He does not give them over to the desire of their foes. Consider what you can do for the poor and needy, and be blessed in this land. For the needy who are labouring for you in some form, help them to do a good job and pay them their full wage. If you want to know more about Food Bank, whether you want to donate or if you fancy volunteering, then have a chat with Ian or Fiona Jarvis. If you want to know more about Christians Against Poverty, then have a quick Google search and have a look on their website. In putting this sermon together, I've learnt that poverty is actually a situation that's very difficult to get out of. It can be very much like a vicious cycle. When people get to such a low point, temptation is harder to resist, and plenty of people succumb to it, and they can sink even lower, just like the gentleman I told you about from the Missing Person TV programme. But Jesus knows this from his own experience of fasting in the wilderness for 40 days and then being tempted by Satan, although he resisted the temptation. And yet those who do succumb to that temptation can still be forgiven and brought back to God. So perhaps that's what you could do for somebody. Thank you.